This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. To pre-order Foundations, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and in this video I'm continuing with my limited set review for Foundations. So far I've looked at all the multicolored, colorless, and white cards, and now we're looking at blue. For each of these cards I'll discuss how I think they'll perform in limited, that means draft and sealed, and I'll punctuate each evaluation with a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews and unsure of what my letter grades mean, you can find a guide in the description for this video. There are a few important things to keep in mind as I review these cards. First, because we're only talking about draft and sealed, I'm only going to be talking about cards that can be found in play boosters. This set is confusing because it has a bunch of different products with different set numbers, but only the cards with set numbers between 1 and 271 matter for limited. So if there was some card in the set you were thinking was going to be in this video and it isn't here, it's because it's a card that you can only get in other Foundations products. Play boosters in this set do have incredibly rare special guests, but I'll cover those in their own video. These are also my evaluations before actually playing Foundations Limited, since the goal is to have this set review done in time for the pre-release. That means I'll be wrong about some stuff, but as the format comes into focus, I'll be doing videos where I discuss how things have turned out. This set is about half reprints, so I have played with a whole lot more of these cards than usual in these set reviews. Lastly, I want to let you know that there are some set review related perks for being a channel member or a patron. You get access to my ongoing set notes during preview season, and you also get a spreadsheet with all of my grades once a set review is complete. If those perks interest you, check out the description where you can find out how to support the channel using one of those methods. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in with a look at the blue cards in Foundations. First up, we've got Arcane Epiphany, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is an uncommon instant that costs 1 generic less to cast if you control a wizard. Draw 3 cards. A 5-mana draw 3 is kind of alright, especially in this set where I feel like you're going to get punished a little bit less for not adding to the board. And lowering the cost of this to 4 is doable. This is the only wizard payoff in the set, so it's not like we saw in the white video where there are like a few cat payoffs and a few angel payoffs. This is the only card that pays you off for having a wizard, so you are less incentivized to do it with other cards, but I still think most blue decks will have a few wizards and be able to cast this for 4, at which point it becomes a really good card. I think it's a C overall. Next up, it's Archmage of Runes, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a 3/6 giant wizard at rare. Instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 generic less to cast, so whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, draw a card. This is an incredibly strong spell payoff. Even if it just drew me cards, I'd be in on it, but decreasing the cost is awesome and pairs nicely with the other ability, as if you keep drawing into more spells, you're more likely to be able to cast them right away. 6 toughness is really nice too, because it really limits the amount of removal that can really efficiently remove this, and that makes it a lot more likely you get to untap and go off with this, which looks very doable. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Big Fin Bouncer, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 3/2 Shark Pirate at common. When it enters, you return target creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand. I, of course, always love Mana Wars, even though they have dropped off a bit of late. Adding a 3/2 to the board and bouncing your opponent's best creature tends to feel pretty good for 4 mana, but if that creature has an enters trigger or something, it can be a little underwhelming. Still, the first couple of these sound pretty nice in blue decks, and they're going to be one of the better blue commons in the set, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Cephalid Ink Mage, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 Octopus Wizard at uncommon. When it enters, you surveil 3, and it has Threshold, which means something good happens if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard. In this case, it becomes unblockable. A 3-mana 2/2 with Surveil 3 is already pretty playable in a set that has Threshold as one of its mechanics. Not only does it give you good card selection, it helps you load your graveyard. The stat line definitely isn't great, but Surveil does mean you get something up front, so I can give it a bit of a pass on that. And in the late game when this is unblockable, it can become a real problem, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Clankant Sky Mage, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 1/1 Bird Wizard at uncommon. It's got flying, and whenever you draw a card, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. I love the text box, but I hate the stat line. It's very expensive for a card that dies to almost everything until you've drawn at least 2 cards, and while it will grow every turn even if you're not trying, its initial vulnerability really holds it back. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Curator of Destinies, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a 5/5 Sphinx at rare. It can't be countered, it has flying, and when it enters, you look at the top 5 cards of your library and separate them into a face-down pile and a face-up pile. An opponent chooses one of those piles, put that pile into your hand and the other into your graveyard. I love me a Fact or Fiction-like effect, especially when stapled onto an imposing flyer. The Arbiter is always going to draw you at least 2 cards while also loading your graveyard, which is certainly relevant because of Threshold. So even if your opponent can take down the Arbiter right away, you've got serious card advantage that is likely to give you enough of an advantage that you're not too upset about it. This is usually going to be a 3-for-1 at worst, and it's a must-kill flying threat. It's a bomb, giving it an A. Next up, it's Drakecatcher, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/3 human wizard. At rare, it's got vigilance and prowess. Whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, put that many incubation counters on it, and you can remove 3 incubation counters from it to create a 2/2 blue Drake creature token with flying. I'm pretty happy with the 2-mana 1/3 with prowess and vigilance. We actually had one in Bloomborough, and it played pretty well. It's tough to block early, since it can grow so easily, and if your opponent doesn't block it, they are risking giving you a Drake, since 2 prowess triggers in 1 turn will give you the necessary incubation counters, and you can also get them over the course of a few turns. So this thing is going to be insane, especially on turn 2, and it stays reasonably relevant all game long, giving it a B. Next up, it's Elementalist Adept, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 human wizard. At common, it's got flash and prowess. A 2/1 prowess isn't quite as good as a 1/3, mostly because to survive combat against other 2-drops, you probably need 2 prowess triggers, which is asking a lot. But this is still a solid little creature, and having flash opens up some nice possibilities. For instance, you might have in your hand, makes things more flexible, giving it a C. Next up, it's Erudite Wizard, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/3 human wizard. At common, whenever you draw your 2nd card each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. We haven't seen that many draw your 2nd card in a turn payoffs actually work in Limited. Most of the time, they've underwhelmed. And this looks pretty underwhelming to me. It has a bad starting point, and while getting counters on it is doable, it isn't going to feel like you're achieving something amazing since you spent 3 mana on a 2/3 to start. Like, you probably need to get 2 counters on this before things feel really good, and it's just hard to do that, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Feybloom Trick, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant. Create 2 1/1 blue fairy creature tokens with flying. When you do, tap target creature and opponent controls. This is pretty sweet. 3 mana for 2 1/1 flyers at instant speed is already a card you'd usually play, especially in a format with lots of prowess, so mixing in the tap effect is great. You can just use it to get a blocker out of the way at the end of your opponent's turn, but you can also use it to stop an attack while adding some blockers to the board. This just feels like it does a lot for the cost, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Grappling Kraken, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a 5/6 Kraken at uncommon. It has landfall, which means when a land enters under your control, something happens. In this case, you tap a creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. This would be way better if it had an enter the battlefield ability like this, mostly because it would have a huge impact on the board right away every time you cast it. Now, there is upside to being landfall instead of an enters trigger, like the fact that you can get the effect more than once, but always getting it when you cast the thing is definitely better. And in an ideal world, you probably want to wait until you can play this and then a land in the same turn, so you get the effect, but that requires 7 total lands, which is no small thing. Overall, this seems a little too clunky to be anything special. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's High Fae Trickster, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 4/2 fairy wizard. At rare, it's got flash and flying, and you can cast spells as though they had flash. I'm already in on a 4 mana 4/2 with flying and flash. That's a solid rate for a creature you can play at instant speed, even with low toughness. Giving flash to your stuff doesn't always come up, but it's definitely useful often enough. It can be especially spicy with creatures, of course, since they can ambush block things. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Homunculus Horde, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 2/2 Homunculus at rare. Whenever you draw your 2nd card each turn, create a token that's a copy of this creature. A 4 mana 2/2 is absolutely horrendous. You don't want very many of those, since they often die to multiple 1 or 2 mana removal spells. The upside here is legit, as you can really snowball if you can draw enough cards often enough, but I'm super skeptical that you'll be able to consistently keep this thing alive long enough and draw an extra card in your turn for it to be worthwhile. It's probably a D. Next up, it's Icewind Elemental, which for 4 generic and a blue is a 3/4 elemental at common. It's got flying, and when it enters, you draw a card and then discard a card. 5 mana 3/4 flyers have held up pretty well, even as limited formats have become more powerful. They're just big enough and evasive enough to be threats, while usually dodging the cheapest removal around. This has a nice little trigger too, as looting is always welcome and limited. It is something that can trigger those when you draw your second card in a turn effects, and it helps you get Threshold. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Inspiration from Beyond, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon sorcery. Mill 3 cards, then return an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand, and it has flashback for 5 generic and 2 blue, which means you can cast it from your graveyard for that cost and then exile it. I don't love that this is a sorcery. That makes it very clunky and something that you can't really cast in the early game, since if you're not adding to the board on turn 3, you're going to be in trouble. However, once a game does go long, this is pretty powerful because it can help you get Threshold while getting back your best spell, and you can even do it twice. Milling it some other way and then casting it late works nicely too. Still, you can't have too many cards that don't affect the board, so it's probably a C. Next up, it's Kaito Cunning Infiltrator, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is a 3 loyalty legendary planeswalker Kaito at Mythic Rare. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, put a loyalty counter on Kaito. He's got a +1, and up to 1 target creature you control can't be blocked this turn. Draw a card, then discard a card. He's got a -2 that makes a 2/1 blue ninja creature token, and a -9 that gives you an emblem with whenever a player casts a spell, you create a 2/1 blue ninja creature token. This looks great. If you're dropping this on 3, your opponent probably just loses most of the time. If you've already got a creature, you probably use that +1 right away, send your creature in, give Kaito another loyalty counter, and loot. At that point, he's got 5 loyalty, and that early in the game, he's almost impossible to take down. And if you're behind, he can make a ninja to protect himself and then start using the +1. That route is less exciting, but still lots of value for 3 mana. Getting to his ultimate is real too, especially late because he can gain so many loyalty counters with his ability. Keep in mind, he gets 1 for each creature that hits your opponent, not just once per turn. I'm giving him an A. Next up, it's Kiora the Rising Tide, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 3/2 legendary merfolk noble at rare. When it enters, you draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards, and she's got Threshold. When she attacks, you create a Scion of the Deep, a legendary 8/8 blue octopus creature token. I'm already really excited about a 3 mana 3/2 that loots twice when it enters. That's already like a B. That kind of card selection is already very strong, and in this format it'll help you get Threshold and trigger your if you draw cards during your turn triggers. And getting an 8/8 out of her is fairly doable, although it's very unlikely Kiora survives the attack herself, but if you can attack with her and trade off and you just have an 8/8 sitting around after, you're going to feel great. But yeah, she has this amazing baseline where you're going to feel pretty good about casting her no matter what. And then she has this potential late game effect that can just break the game wide open. I think she's a bomb. I'm giving her an A-. Next up, it's Lunar Insight, which for 2 generic and a blue is a rare sorcery. Draw a card for each different mana value among non-land permanents you control. So you probably need to draw at least 3 cards with this for it to feel good. And in some ways, I think this is a lot worse than Divination is. This is because Divination is always 3 mana to draw 2, and it isn't like that card is great and limited. This does have more late game upside, but it's also pretty dead in your opening hand. And even in the mid to late game, you're going to have boards where this is still just drawing you 2. I think that means it's a C. Next up, it's Mischievous Mystic, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 human wizard at uncommon. It's got flying. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, you make a 1/1 blue fairy creature token with flying. A 2 mana 2/1 flyer is a nice card that almost always makes the cut. It's like a C. And this just spitting out 1 flyer feels great, and it can turn into a value engine. This is a draw your second card payoff that I can definitely get behind because the baseline is so good, and you only need to trigger it once to feel good about it. Giving it a B. Next up, it's Refute, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is a common instant. Counter target spell, draw a card, then discard a card. This new take on Cancel is an upgrade, as looting is a pretty great effect, including in this set for reasons I've already mentioned. That said, it is still a 3 mana counterspell that demands 2 blue, and that mana investment asks way too much sometimes, and it still hurts if your opponent plays around it. Cancel's usually like a D or a D+, and I think this is a C-. Next up, it's Rune Sealed Wall, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 0/6 artifact creature wall. At uncommon, it's got Defender, and you can tap it to Surveil 1. Cards that are so all in on being defensive don't fare very well in limited, and while this can surveil, giving you some much needed card selection and perhaps helping you get Threshold, it's still not a card you're ever going to be very happy about playing. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Skyship Buccaneer, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a 4/3 human pirate. At uncommon, it's got flying and raid, which means if you attack this turn, something good happens. In this case, you draw a card when it enters. A 5 mana 4/3 flyer that always draws you a card is like A- territory. Like, that's a powerful 2-for-1 where you add a creature to the board that can be a real problem if your opponent doesn't deal with it. A 5-mana 4/3 with flying and nothing else going on is probably like a C-, and that's a massive chasm. The good news is, because its raid trigger draws you a card, you can even make a bad attack in a pinch and feel fine about it, and as long as you can set up at least a trade, it's going to feel good. I think this will be relatively easy to get the card out of, but not like A- level easy. It's more like a B. Next up, it's Sphinx of Forgotten Lore, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a 3/3 Sphinx at Mythic Rare with Flash and Flying. When it attacks, target instant or sorcery card in your graveyard gains flashback until end of turn. The flashback cost is equal to that card's mana cost. This Flying Snapcaster Mage-esque card is pretty sweet. It does have to attack to let you flash something back, but because it has Flash, that isn't a huge challenge. You can flash it in during your opponent's instep, and then attack before they can do anything about it, thus getting the 2-for-1 that you really want. Like all flash creatures, you can also, of course, ambush block with it, which can open up the possibility for even a 3-for-1 before your opponent ever has a chance to remove it. You do have to have instants and sorceries in your graveyard, but that's not a crazy thing to ask for in a blue deck. I think this is a bomb, giving it an A. Next up, it's Strix Lookout, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/2 bird at common with flying and vigilance. You can pay 1 generic and a blue and tap it to draw a card and then discard a card. This is solid. It can get in for some damage early, and later in the game, the looting becomes valuable. It's not great at either attacking or blocking or looting, but it's decent enough at all of it to be a C. Next up, it's Uncharted Voyage, which for 3 generic and a blue is a common instant. Target creature's owner puts it on their choice of the top or bottom of their library, and you surveil 1. This kind of card has overperformed relative to where people are taking them in the drafts several sets in a row at this point. The fact is, this is a 4-mana removal spell that gives you a 1-for-1 at instant speed, and it opens up the possibility of even giving you a 2-for-1, and it has a bit of card selection tacked on, and this is also a format with a spell deck, which could make it even better. I'm giving it a C+. It's still not premium removal, it's too expensive, but people really treat this as if it's just a straight-up bounce spell, but it's significantly better. Alright, let's move into the blue reprints, starting with Aegis Turtle. For 1 blue mana, it is a 0/5. Purely defensive creatures don't tend to be worth it in Limited, and that's all this is. It's difficult to feel like you're getting a card of value when you play a 0/5 that can't do anything effectively apart from block, and calling that effective is even a stretch, since it's not like it scares creatures away from attacking, it just absorbs damage. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Aetherize, which for 3 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant. Return all attacking creatures to their owner's hands. It's tempting to imagine this letting you bounce your opponent's whole board when they alpha strike, but that doesn't happen as often as it needs to, and even when it does, it's not much more than like a slightly better fog effect, and those are notoriously awful in Limited. You can also use it to save your own attacking creature sometimes, but that additional utility still isn't enough for me to be all that interested in this. It's too narrow and too expensive, giving it a D. Next up, it's Brineborn Cutthroat, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 Merfolk Pirate at uncommon. It's got Flash. Whenever you cast a spell during an opponent's turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. A 2-mana 2/1 with Flash isn't particularly good on its own, but growing this is pretty doable in blue decks. It's probably blue-red where it'll grow the most because you're going to have the most spells, including instants. And once you get the first counter on this, you feel fine, and after that, it can turn into a pretty significant threat. It does take some work, though, and it has a bad starting point, giving it a C. Next up, it's Essence Scatter, which for 1 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant, counter target creature spell. This is always a really nice counter spell. It tends to counter about 80% of the spells in most opponents' decks for only 2 mana, and you only need 1 blue. You can get some serious tempo when you counter something that costs 5 or 6 mana, and you're usually going to be able to leave the mana up for it when you need to, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Extravagant Replication. For 4 generic and 2 blue, it's a rare enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, create a token that's a copy of another target non-land permanent you control. So you have to wait a whole turn for this to do something, and that does make me sad. If it triggered during your instep, it would be a bomb. As is, you spend 6 mana and don't impact the board for a whole turn, but once the ball gets rolling on this, it can and will take over the game. It even lets you copy tokens, unlike some other cards that we've seen that only let you copy non-token creatures. So you're unlikely to run out of targets to copy if it triggers even once. So yeah, you sort of have to cross your fingers for a turn, but after that first turn, you'll probably be okay. And if you can last much longer, you're going to run away with the game, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Fleeting Distraction, which for 1 blue mana is a common instant. Target creature gets -1/-0 until end of turn, draw a card. The effect itself is weak, but it can occasionally work like a combat trick that helps your creature survive combat while killing your opponent's creature, and that's more likely in a set with prowess, because prowess sort of augments this in terms of how good it is as a combat trick. But you really need to be playing it in that sort of deck because it's a cheap spell that replaces itself that has kind of a meaningless effect, and that's not really worth running in like your typical blue deck. So I think it needs a build around grade. It's like a D+ in most blue decks and a C if you're playing blue-red. Next up, it's Imprisoned in the Moon, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon enchantment aura. Enchant creature, land, or planeswalker. Enchanted permanent is a colorless land with tap, add colorless, and loses all other card types and abilities. This can deal with almost anything, and by the late game, giving your opponent some random mana doesn't really matter. However, you really can't use this in the early game. I mean, sure, you get rid of a problematic creature maybe, but you also ramp your opponent's mana, which makes it pretty easy for them to shrug it off. And no matter what, you're never really getting a full card worth of value here. That's why this has performed poorly in the past, and while it's only the kind of removal you run in an emergency, giving it a D. Next up, it's Light Shell Duo, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 3/4 rat otter at common with prowess, and when it enters, you surveil 2. This is a super recent reprint, and it was pretty solid in Bloomburrow. Even if it only had one of these abilities, it would probably see play, and having both is good. Even though this set isn't set up exactly the same way Bloomburrow is, it does sort of work as a signpost common because it's going to be good in the Threshold decks, which are blue-black, and good in the Prowess decks, which are blue-red. It's never going to be amazing in either of them, but it has some nice effects and some decent stats. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Micromancer, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 3/3 human wizard at uncommon. When it enters, you may search your library for an instant or sorcery card with mana value 1, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. This played pretty well last time we saw it. Now, you do need to have at least like 2 1-mana spells in your deck, and that isn't guaranteed, so it needs a build around grade, because a 4-mana 3/3 these days is just an F. But it's a C+ or even a B- in a deck that has the right spells to grab. If you can grab Burst Lightning with this, for example, it's going to feel amazing. Next up, it's Mocking Sprite, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/1 fairy rogue at common, and instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 generic less to cast. This was not very good in Wilds of Eldraine, but that's partly because that set had a bunch of incidental ping and -1/-1 effects that made it very easy to kill this without using up a whole card. There's less of that in this format, so I think it'll perform better. The spell cost reduction can be pretty sweet in a prowess deck. The stat line is still pretty bad though, so I think I'm going to start it at a C-. Next, it's an Offer You Can't Refuse, which for 1 blue mana is an uncommon instant. Counter target non-creature spell its controller creates 2 treasure tokens. Yeah, this isn't here for limited players. It was awful in limited last time, and there's no reason it won't be here. Paying 1 to counter a non-creature spell, if that's where it ended, would be pretty good. Even though you don't have a ton of targets in most limited formats, your opponent's going to have like 6 or 7 things, and countering it for 1 would be great. But giving your opponent treasure in exchange, not so much. That means you always come out behind. It is true that in the extreme late game, this can feel fine, but early, you just can't cast it. And that kind of defeats the purpose of it being so cheap. It's an F. Next up, it's Omniscience, which for 7 generic and 3 blue is a mythic rare enchantment. You may cast spells from your hand without paying their mana costs. Also, not here for limited. 10 mana is a lot. And the funny thing is, even if you do get this into play in limited, it's still not going to do anything most of the time because you don't have cards by that point. It's an F. Next up, it's Run Away Together, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant. Choose 2 target creatures controlled by different players. Return those creatures to their owner's hands. This was kind of okay in Eldraine, but it wasn't very good in Bloomburrow. And that set even had a prominent theme where you could get extra value out of bouncing your own creatures. In a set like this one, which doesn't really have that going on in a big way, this just ends up being an awkward bounce spell most of the time. I think it's a D+. Next up, it's Self-Reflection, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is an uncommon sorcery. Create a token that's a copy of target creature you control, and it has flashback for 3 generic and a blue. We just saw this a few sets ago, and it wasn't very good. Casting it for 6 is particularly brutal, as it's hard to make a token worth that amount of mana consistently. In the long run, this can generate a 2-for-1 because of flashback, and if you mill it instead of casting it the first time, getting a token for 4 mana isn't too bad. I do think this will be better in this format than it was in Lost Caverns of Ixalan, where it was a D at the very best, mostly because this format has a more pronounced spell and flashback theme, but I still don't think it's great, giving it a D+. Next up, it's Spectral Sailor, which for 1 blue mana is a 1/1 Spirit Pirate at uncommon. It's got flash and flying, and you can pay 3 generic and a blue to draw a card. This played pretty well last time. It's nice to have on turn 1, since it can get in for a few hits, and in the late game you can sink mana into it to find some action, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Think Twice, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant, draw a card, and you can flash it back for 2 generic and a blue. This is better than it looks. In the long run, it gives you a 2-for-1 while also triggering spell payoffs twice. It isn't the most efficient at what it does, but in limited, you're usually going to have time to easily get both cards and probably some spell triggers, so that's okay. Giving it a C+. Next up, it's Time Stop, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a rare instant, and it says, in the turn. I'm going to read the reminder text too because this is not a common effect. It says, exile all spells and abilities, including this spell. The player whose turn it is discards down to their maximum hand size. Damage heals in this turn until end of turn effects end. Core sets are supposed to be simple, so including this is pretty weird because that's an effect many experienced players never see. Anyway, basically, Time Stop empties the stack without anything resolving and skips all the remaining phases in your opponent's turn. It's kind of a reverse Time Walk with a little bit of counterspell upside mixed in, and it can be powerful, but it costs a bunch of mana, making that a lot less attractive. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Tolarian Terror, which for 6 generic and a blue is a 5/5 Serpent at common. It costs 1 generic less to cast for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard, and it is word 2. It would not be an exaggeration to say this was the most important common in Dominaria United Limited. It was great in spell decks, mostly because it was relatively easy to get cheap spells in the graveyard and then slam this big boy on the table, with the ward making it a real pain to deal with. It is a build-around, you can't just play this in any old blue deck, but if you're in blue-red or a spell-heavy blue-black deck, it's a B-level card and probably a C- in other blue decks. And our last blue card is Witness Protection, which for 1 blue mana is a common enchantment aura with Enchant Creature. Enchanted creature loses all abilities and is a green and white citizen creature with base power and toughness 1/1 named Legitimate Business Person. I'm kind of interested to see how this card does. It was awful. One of the worst cards in the set in New Capenna. This is partly because it's a removal spell that allows your opponent to still hold on to something that can attack and block and even potentially kill X1s in combat. We did just see in Duskmourn a similar card be really good, but that card made the creature a 0/2, which is substantially better, and Duskmourn was an enchantment format. And both of those things made it better than Witness Protection, but at the same time, Capenna was kind of a lopsided format where there was lots of tempo and lots of attacking, where a card like this didn't really work out. So it's probably not quite the F it was in Capenna, but it's still not very good. It's the kind of removal spell you're going to play when you're desperate. It does trigger prowess too, which kind of matters. I'm giving it a D. Alright, so those are all the blue cards in Foundations. Next, I'll look at all the black ones. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on the rest of this set review, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.